And welcome everyone. My name is Ed Guo, and the biomedical department chair at the Columbia in here. And before I introduce the speaker, I have a few instructions to give. So today we continue to offer this lecture in a hybrid format with both virtual and live audience. Our speaker will present approximately 40 to 45 minutes. And we will leave about 15 minutes at the end for question and answer. So for the virtual audience, if you successfully log into the Zoom, I assume you know how to use in the Q&A feature. And if not, I can tell you, don't use in chat. We're not going to answer your chat, and then will come in the Q&A features. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A sessions at the end. For a live audience, you actually have a chance to ask some questions, and then I encourage you to ask the questions. We used to have a lunch, maybe in next seasons, Paul can restart the lunch traditions. So we as threatened student, if you don't asking questions from the student, and then take the lunch back, but that's just a threat. So today is really my honor to pleasure to welcome Tom Talavage, and professor and head of the Department of Biomedical Engineering at the University of Cincinnati. And he received a bachelor's in computer and electrical engineering and master in electrical engineering from Purdue University. I think he mentioned at dinner. And his dad also was a professor at Purdue University. So therefore, really long history of Purdue. And then did a PhD in the speech and hearing science from the MIT Harvard Division of Health Science and Technology, HST, which I graduated just a year before Tom joined the HST. And so Tom is the first to document pathophysiology arising from repeated head impact in absence of concussion. That's actually quite fascinating. My son actually had a concussion during when he was an undergraduate at Columbia here, and then in ski, which is not surprising to you, and also probably not surprising to Professor Barclay Morrison. And this work has been nationally featured, including Sports Illustrated. Well, that's pretty impressive, 2010, and the Real Sports with Brian Gumbel. Wow, that's and the Nova 2013 with addition coverage with PBS Frontline. I definitely also a frequent watch of Friday Night Economics and the ESPN 2020. So let's give a welcome to Professor Talavage.
Thank you very much, Ed. Okay, I think I need to reshare my slides. Share screen, I believe should work.
So you have your mic on, right?
Right, mic is on. I'll close this here. All right. So thank you very much for having me here. This is a joy to be here. Just a little bit more, just to fill in a little bit more about this, because it actually makes a lot of what I talk about later make a little more sense if you understand that I have a really wacky background. So I started out actually as a computer engineering student, did a dual degree at Purdue, finished that up a number of years back. I then actually moved into the area of artificial intelligence because I was, as a computer engineer, that was the topic that intrigued me. So early expert systems, early diagnostic reasoning systems, and in terms of data sciences, data knowledge. So I have this background in the data sciences, a background in AI. I got out of it because, of course, 30 years ago, we were by and large still just solving toy problems. And I was far more interested in actually understanding neural circuitry. How does the brain work? How do we actually respond to things? And my primary interest was actually in language back in those days, because of the fact that I was always intrigued by the idea that I can simply sit here, breathe a little bit out, move some articulators, produce vibrations in the air, and somehow those vibrations end up resulting in a concept that's in my brain being a concept that's in your brain. And that's just very weird. So I decided I wanted to go into that. So I studied speech and hearing sciences at MIT Harvard. I actually got hooked in and roped in very early on to this brand new fangled idea, modern phrenology using functional magnetic resonance imaging. And so I actually was one of the first people, actually was the first MGH-NMR student to finish a degree only using functional MRI. My area was actually auditory neuroimaging. I mapped out auditory cortex in the brain. Okay. Sorry, I'll try. So I mapped out ton of topic mappings in the human brain. That was actually where I got from. I then went to Purdue, became a faculty member, grew through the ranks. Basically, because I was now at a place that no longer at a medical school, began focusing a little bit more on imaging hardware. We did some of that, brought an MRI facility to Purdue. Then we brought a new real on-campus MRI facility to Purdue. But along the line, I really decided, and because of what the research we're going to be talking about, I had moved into an area where I really needed clinical partnerships, and I needed to have access to, on a day-to-day basis, to expertise outside of just the engineering domain, which is why I ended up moving to the University of Cincinnati 3 years ago to become the department head. So that's kind of the long journey and why I am where I am and what I'm doing. The work we're going to talk about today has been not exactly made me rich or made me famous in terms of the production for my university. The entire support over the last 15 years basically has been a little over $1.25 million, but we've certainly had an outsized effect for that amount of money coming in. The real money spent was probably closer to 6 if you account all the imaging time we spent that we never paid for, but I was, whatever happens. So this is just a good illustration of what we're talking about. Football, of course, is a wonderful lab for head injury, because you have an awful lot of that occurring on a day-to-day basis. Now, of course, this is young kids. What you don't get to hear, because of the fact that this doesn't quite capture it, is that at the end, that little child is crying on the field because he's had this huge impact and it has legitimately hurt quite intensely. We got into this area partly because we're sports fans, but also because around this time, 2005, 2008, there started to become all this very big interest in what was happening as a consequence of all of these concussions or head injuries that were taking place in sports. Bennett Omalu, eventually played by Will Smith, and working with Julian Bales, eventually played by Alec Baldwin, which was actually one of the best representations of a person I've ever seen, because I know both. I know Julian and Alec nailed him. But they were discovering that these players who played a lot of football were having some really serious neurodegenerative disorders within their brain. And then around the time we got started in this, Anne McKee at Boston University started to say, you know what? The level of neurodegeneration is not linked or is not tightly coupled to the number of diagnosed concussions. Now, that's good for me because I have had 7 diagnosed concussions from sports. So I'm hopeful that I'm not suddenly ending up with massive CTE in a few years. But at the same time, it was a very interesting and profound finding. Well, around at the time Anne's paper was coming out, we had started to do our own study looking at some youth athletes. And what we started to find was that when we took high school kids and we observed them, and we actually took a baseline before participation began, tracked them during the season and looked at them through the course of the season, we were finding that their brain activation, how they were responding to tasks and how they were responding structurally was changing over the course of the season. There were notable changes over the course of the season, and those changes were linked not so much to did they get hit, did they get concussed, but it was rather that they were linked to how many times had they been hit and how hard were those impacts, which is starting to tell us, and I mean, this makes sense in a generic comment, that you already know that if you go out and you run too much, you'll develop stress fractures and other repetitive strain injuries. Everybody can get carpal tunnel from sitting there on our keyboards with poor form. So it should be completely unsurprising that hitting your head is not a good idea. So, but at the same time, this is a big issue, because what it's really starting to say, and this is why we ended up going down this whole pathway, is that there starts to be a disconnect between the clinical diagnosis of concussion and the underlying pathophysiology, and is somebody healthy? So this is our kind of little quick demo to illustrate that symptoms are not equivalent to injury. These are some data from our early study. We have on the left a series of high school non-collision sport athletes, track, baseball, tennis. Sometimes they get hit in the head, but not majorly. It's not a normal part of the game. And we have them performing just a simple 2-back working memory task and a 1-back working memory task. And this is the contrast between clicking the button when the letter you see is an immediate repeat versus clicking the button when the letter you see is the one that was shown to previous. Very simple, basic working memory task. And there's a particular constellation where we get some, parietal lobe, some frontal lobe activation. And that constellation at preseason for these 2 individual athletes is pretty consistent. This is fMRI, right? It's not precise. So as far as it goes, this is a great reproduction of the actual or expected map. These are those two athletes later in that season. And obviously there are substantial changes in terms of the bias. So in this case, the red is areas that were more active during the harder task, the 2-back working memory task. The blue is the areas that were more active during the 1-back or easier working memory task, or at some level, since we thresholded this down to 0, also areas that are reasonably equivalent in activation. And what really needs to be taken away from that right-hand side is that for both of these athletes, there's either been one of two ways: an increase in the amount of activation required to perform the 1-back task, which has reduced the bias toward the 2-back task, or both tasks are just simply equivalent in difficulty. Okay, either a reduction in the 2-back, whatever. But only one of these athletes was identified at this time as actually having a concussion. The other athlete, however, had just completed a week where they had participated in 2 practices and a game and accumulated over 240 impacts to the head that exceeded 10 times the force of gravity. So the acceleration of gravity. So the top one was actually an athlete who we got lucky, to be quite honest with you. This was actually supposed to be his first postseason scan. We just finished the football season. We actually scanned him 3 weeks before, but he happened to be a diver. And he was coming in for his postseason scan. And the night before, he'd happened to over-rotate on his dive, smacked the water, and was actually unconscious in the pool. We didn't know this. He comes in, he's like, yeah, I got concussed last night. We're like, oh my, thanks for telling us. And then this other guy is the one who simply had a lot of hits. And the main issue is that because the diagnosis is symptom-based rather than actual pathophysiology-based or really functionality-based, the bottom athlete is declared to be healthy and continues to play and continues to experience hits. He's Tua Tagovailoa, basically, right? Okay, the guy goes out, clearly from anybody who's watching is impaired after falling down and hitting his head on the turf, gets up, stumbles, but because they have omitted, ataxia from the concussion symptom list, he's defined by the NFL not to have experienced a concussion, goes out a week later, actually 5 days later, and gets absolutely smashed and misses most of the rest of the season. Okay, there's your example of what's going on. Okay, so symptoms are merely a subset of the injury. So we can get that off at the top. I don't know if I can or not. I guess not. Yeah, if we can hide that, that would be good. I'm not sure where it is. High floating. Thank you. Okay. So what do we really mean by these subconcussive injuries then? Because that's where we are. We're saying that. Just a quick example, a nice engineering example of asymptomatic injury. For anybody who's an airline or airplane buff, the de Havilland Comet is, of course, rather infamous. These were one of the early, first, I believe, jet airliner out there. And they ended up being taken out of service for 4 years because several of these planes suddenly disintegrated mid-flight, killing, obviously, a number of people. So quite big tragedies. And the question was, what was going on? Well, eventually it was determined that what was happening is, if you notice, if you look carefully at that image, let me see, here we go, pointer. Turn it on. And do I have it on? Let's see here if I can get it. Quite sure how to turn that on at the moment. Won't worry about it. The windows are square. Yep, okay. Oh, that's fine. Okay, now it's on. Thank you. Okay. Okay. So if we look over here, you see that the windows on the de Havilland Comet are square. So at each of those corners, these would now actually generate a large amount of stress. And on top of that, there was a bunch of punch riveting around these square windows. As a result, every time you had a decompression cycle and a repressurization cycle, you would actually develop small cracks in those windows. And after a certain number of pressurization cycles, they would rupture. So today, we've used this information. First off, you notice all of your planes have oval windows, so you don't have those nice square corners where you can actually collect the stress. But on top of that, they monitor and they keep track of how many pressurization cycles there are. And after every so many pressurization cycles, they go through and they do a very detailed assessment of the integrity of the hull. Another example, the Northeast blackout from 20 years ago. We got ourselves down to the point where we had one line that was actually transmitting all of the power from the Midwest out to the Northeast. During the rainstorm, that line eventually went down. The point is nobody was really monitoring that they were down to a single final pathway. And therefore, nobody was really looking out for this. So that monitoring had failed, totally preventable. So what we're really arguing then in concussion is that concussion is a little misleading because it is symptom-based, but the reality is that we're getting an injury where we're affecting whether or not we're getting information delivered from point A to point B. We know from a neural perspective, we deliver information, we produce action potentials at that remote location through summation in time and or place, overlap of input signals. And that symptoms then are really arising when we get to the point where we aren't getting enough information there in time, we aren't getting enough information there at all, or we're getting collateral projections that normally aren't predominant are now having to be predominant. So the pathway is now out of whack. So we're not getting information from A to B at the appropriate time, at the appropriate number of events to produce correct transmission of information to the next stage. That's when we finally get symptoms. So the question becomes from the concussion side, can we actually detect before we reach this stage? So before you're actually failing to get information from A to B, and can we ultimately intervene and prevent you from getting to the point where you do have symptoms? But also recognizing then that we can have injury where we have a weakened pathway, and we can't see that just by observing your behavior. All right. So how do we assess an injury with no symptoms? We've just been using structural health monitoring. Basic concept is you take your structure, you evaluate it periodically by some non-destructive mechanism. And from that, you decide, okay, is this thing okay? Do we keep going? Do we not keep going? What's our classification? Is it failing? Is it weak? Is it okay? Do we need to do some repair? Do we need to just leave it? And if it's like a biological system, let it rest so it can recover. That's the general concept. So our study that we used for the 12 years we were at Purdue doing this was to actually take their individual subjects, evaluate them before the season, within the season, and after the season using some sort of non-destructive monitoring, track the stress and exposure that occurred during the season by some mechanism of monitoring impacts or at least accelerations on the head, track that out, plot those things to decide, hey, do we have now given us ability from looking at the neuroimaging measures to differentiate between individuals who truly were still pretty darn healthy in the sense that their physiology hadn't been altered versus impaired in the context that they could still perform tasks and still were not diagnosed with any symptoms, but showed clear pathophysiology, clear changes in the physiologic behavior. And then obviously we have the concussed group. And of course, the real question becomes, how similar and how different are those last two groups? And therefore, are the symptoms the right thing to be looking at? So we did this over 11 years, studied 12 different teams, 600 subjects, about 2,000 MRI scans, where we collect data pre-season. We monitored them during the season. We had a number of different tools we used over that. We'll talk about how useless most of those were. Do some sort of on-field neurological assessment when they're theoretically impaired, and then look at them within the season and after the season. So we did that with high school, women's soccer, men's football, one middle school football team, boys football team. We worked with one season of college football and women's soccer, and we've also then worked with some professional athletes through the spring league and the XFL. It's a lot of good stuff, a lot of interesting stuff. There's a ton of data there. We'll be probably processing those data till I retire. What comes out of this? So this is one of the first things we actually published, and it's a useful illustration. There's some misleading stuff on here, but not because we intend it, it's because the systems actually aren't that great. At the top, so what I've got here are 4 categories. We've got our controls. These are, again, non-collision sport athletes, high school kids, same school, same age, same gender. So they're a representative sample of what the activation pattern should look for this 2-back versus 1-back comparison. Our first group are athletes where when we at least look at the activation patterns, we don't see substantive decreases or anything that really highlights a major problem in terms of their fMRI activity during the season. So we kind of said, okay, they're not concussed. They don't have any impairment, obvious impairment in the functional perspective. So we give them a category. And it turns out that group, if you end up looking at their data, tend not to have taken very many hits to the head, which is maybe not surprising. But on top of that, they also don't take a lot of big high hits. So this particular individual that's on the left plot was one of the outside linebackers for one of our football team. He took about 200, 240 hits over the course of a 14-week season. so that includes preseason. He was a starter, played basically every down, and got ragged on by the coaches constantly for the fact that he didn't lead with his head and he didn't make big, impactful hits. But we never saw him fail to make a tackle. Good guy in terms of rugby style tackling, wrap, roll, pull them down. And if you look at his hit pattern, you see that he doesn't take a lot of impacts to the head. Now, the localization there is spotty. This is the hit system that is advocated by Rydell, originally developed by Simbex. It has a really bad flaw in that we didn't know this at the time. When they model the impact, they give 6 linear accelerometers, but when they go to determine what acceleration actually occurred, they say that this movement cannot occur. So they completely preclude rotation about your z-axis. So as a consequence, if you really had a big side-to-side impact like this that forces your head to yank, you now have a big vector this way, a big vector this way, but it can't allow for a rotation. So it predicts a hit to the top of the head. So yeah, anyway, so you'll see that in our middle category now, this is where we have our big hitters. These were our guys who hit a ton, 1,800, 2,000 hits over the course of a 14-week season. They end up with really substantive decreases in contrast, so really suggesting that the brain is equally active for both the 1-back and the 2-back test. Note that for none of these athletes did we have a failure or a drop in performance on the task. They can do the task. It's just the balance that the brain is using to get their changes. At the top, you see this huge pile of hits. Now, there's a big emphasis there at the top front of the head. Rydell actually changed their helmet design based on that, but as I just pointed out, it turns out that may not be accurate because of the hit system having a really, really bad algorithm for hit localization inside of it. But okay, whatever. But in this case, for the athlete that's illustrated here, it is correct because this was a 6'7" offensive lineman who really did on every play lower his head and drive forward. I don't know why you're doing that when you're 6'7" playing high school football, because you're already, 6 inches taller than pretty much everybody on the field. You should be able to push them around. Anyway, he didn't do that. And on the right was one of our athletes, a middle linebacker who had a concussion. And if you note, there's not a lot of change in his actual activation pattern, but he was diagnosed with a concussion. And he did a lot of hits, but he didn't do a lot of bad hits, but he would get big high G hits. So you start sitting here saying, okay, clearly the number of hits seems to play a role. Clearly the magnitude of the hits plays a role. And we're wondering at that point also if maybe the location on the head plays a role, because instead of taking hits in the top of the head, he tended to have a lot of hits because he would impact and then fall to the ground or go in sideways, like diving into a player. So he'd be taking hits all over his skull. So the question is what's going on? What are the factors that matter? Well, as I've mentioned already, we do have to worry about those forces and where they're occurring because they're huge. So like, for example, some of these classic examples of Daryl Stingley, Eric Legrand, and I can't remember Everett's first name with the Bills, but when they had those impacts, when they led with their head straight down, they delivered about 5,000 to 12,000 pounds of force to the neck, which your spine is not designed to handle. So we care about this. Now, interestingly enough, we still actually have no idea what are the real forces that are present in these sporting collisions. All the devices are using accelerometers, which report an accelerometer based either for the helmet, which can move relative to your head, or maybe on the skin patch, which is good, but that's now the skull that's moving, and we still don't know the actual input force that came into that. But what we have found is if we use like that patch that sits on the ear, it turns out that the distribution of accelerations that are experienced by athletes are surprisingly consistent and stable, independent of the sport or the age. And that has some real implications, because what that's really saying to us is that, okay, it's not a function of the level of play, it's not a function of the age, but it is, in terms of the number of hits, we do have a dependence on age. Younger kids tend to take many fewer hits. It's for certain sports and football than the older kids do. And in high school, we do see that football leads to more hits than soccer, which is really unsurprising. That was kind of the sun came up in the east today observation, but it's relevant because what we're really getting here is that we're getting these. There may be lesser forces for smaller athletes. We would expect that they simply don't have the speed and force to generate when they hit one another, but it turns out that the accelerations aren't changing, which starts to suggest that we've actually kind of designed the rules of our sports around this factor to prevent there from being too many of these high G impacts? It'd be an interesting study to go back. We need to get to rugby. We need to get to boys soccer. And if we have those, we can start to fill in the grid and start to assess this. But it is very interesting that the sports don't change. The acceleration distribution is consistent. So at the end of the day, what we do find is that younger athletes get exposed really a little bit more than the older athletes do. JV kids who are playing JV and varsity as floaters in high school, they play many more quarters. They actually end up getting hit a lot more. Youth kids, they may not accumulate per se a larger number of impacts, but they also typically play a season that's about only 2/3 the length of a high school team. So as a result, even though they get hit a little less, they've actually been hit more on a per event basis. So there's an interesting question up here about how we're training our kids, how we're building this up. So anyway, just a few comments on that. But one comment, as I've already said, the telemetry is really coarse. Most of the devices are fairly inaccurate, often wildly so. The RMS errors can be as low as 20-30%, which is pretty good. Some of them are over 100%. That Simbax hit system was over 100% for its RMS error. The average error was 0 or about 0, but the RMS error is enormous. So no individual hit measurement is informative, but the ensemble gives you a good sense. So that's why we stick with hit counts rather than numbers for most of our work. Some of them have some incorrect kinematics. A lot of them have really bad machine learning. If you want to see machine learning used totally inappropriately, go talk to most companies that develop these types of telemetry. They're really bad. So those of you who have expertise in this, there's probably some serious consulting bucks to be made. And some of them are just simply unsafe. So example here that I've highlighted, this was the vector mouthguard by Iwan Biometrics. And it turns out that, within a few weeks, the kids had chewed through the system. And so I don't know if you can really see it here on the screen, but those online probably have an opportunity to. But right in here, there are exposed wires. So they've actually chewed through this. You now have exposed wires from their sensor, which is a great thing. Another one of the classic ones that's unsafe, the Wake Forest Care Consortium group decided to put some X2 Biosystems X patches in a retainer, but they actually have wires soldered to the leads of the lithium-ion battery, and they are passing through openings in the retainer. So, which is really not necessarily a safe thing for anybody who's done some implantable devices. So, but at least this has given us some criteria. We've been working through with several companies and several groups. We're currently trying to get hold of these hit IQ systems out in New Zealand, which actually have the telemetry and everything embedded in the mouthguard. Now they also have the lithium-ion battery embedded in the mouthguard, which makes you nervous, but they have at least accounted for the fact that if there's a puncture, they have safety systems and systems in place so that it does not lead to a nice, wonderful lithium-ion battery fire. So that's a good thing. We're going to see how that works. Okay. And finally, as noted, we have the acceleration, not the force. We do eventually need to get to that force. And so we've been trying to work on that direction. Okay, so what did we really observe overall this time period? Well, what we've ultimately found as we've gone through this work is that these asymptomatic changes are really common, in fact, almost ubiquitous throughout the brain. So here's just a small sample of them. And I'll walk through some of the key issues here. Functionally, from a neuroimaging perspective, I've already shown you the functional fMRI data. Yeah, okay, that's great. That was what we got into Sports Illustrated the first time and everything. But what's actually been interesting is that we've continued to go through this. We find many other aspects. So this was the study where we looked at cerebrovascular reactivity. So essentially, if we're coming out of a breath hold, how fast does everything respond? And what we found is that there was a definite dependence in terms of performance of the cerebrovascular activity. And what we got out of this, albeit, let's see if I get this to come up. Where are we? There we are. Was we actually had a nice little peak in behavior in terms of our ability to fit the observed change when we associated with impacts that the athletes had taken. Now, this was using the X patch, so we're down to about a 20 to 30% RMS error for these data. And so if we were to take the number, all the impacts the athlete did, and we would say, okay, you've had so many impacts, does that number predict the change in your CVR? We found that our best fit came when we kept the hits that were at least 50 G and above. And then we were actually able to obtain a decent R squared out of that. So that was interesting, and it gave us an interesting number. And so it says, okay, so 50 G, there might be something around here that's important. When we look at functional connectivity, we just kind of got a generic, boy, the raw number of hits you get is a big deal. So this was an old study where we just were doing seed-based connectivity, looking at the posterior cingulate cortex, and the number of connections that had a significant significant level of activity or relation to the PCC were actually a little bit elevated in our athletes preseason, dropped precipitously after the period of 2-day practices, the very beginning of the season, climbed back up during the season, then dropped again during the last quarter of the season, or actually the last 3 weeks of the season, when the athletes were getting ready for the postseason football tournament. And so actually in those last 3 weeks, which represents about 20% of the season, the athletes experienced about 30%, 35% of the number of impacts they took over the entire 14 weeks. So that was an area where we had a big drop, and then it recovered a bit during the postseason. So there's a couple interesting things. Number one, the athletes looked to be almost hyper-connected initially. Possibly this is just that because of injuries, the collateral connections are a little stronger than they otherwise normally would be. So you end up with a little bit of hyperconnectivity. It drops during periods of large impact, whether that's because we're not necessarily breaking connections, but at least we're certainly weakening some of the pathways. And then it does seem to come back. So that was an interesting finding. We've kind of followed that up more recently, looking at functional connectome fingerprinting. And what we find here is that athletes' eye self, their ability to look like themselves, their self-identifiability actually goes down in the latter half of that season as well. This is a different subset of data from our study. So this has been recently submitted. We'll see if we ever get a review back. It's been 5 months. But at least it's an interesting one, and it does seem to be linked to a couple of specific areas. Ventral attention networks, somatomotor networks seem to have the most drop in their self-identifiability as we go through the season. Again, these are things that are interesting because they aren't showing per se symptoms, but they are showing us that there are changes in the underlying physiology, and they are very well linked yet again to when have the athletes taken a lot of impacts. We looked at the neurochemistry through MR spectroscopy. Here, what was interesting is when we look at changes in the brain chemistry, neurotransmitter accumulation, whatever, myoinositol increases, so we're trying to keep, osmotic pressure, osmotic regulation is going up, then that also seemed to link to this about 50 G hit point. So we've got at least a couple pieces of data that say, hey, something is occurring in that 45, 50, 55 G range. That seems to be at least producing a larger impact, a larger effect than we might like to see. But when we go and we look at, say, white matter structure in the DTI, we find that actually pretty much any hit matters. Every time we got above every threshold of above 20 G, we found that did a decent job of predicting the data, but it was actually highest when we were down and taking in essentially every hit that exceeded 20 G. Just as a side note, for almost all of our data, we only ever count hits above 20 G, and that's mostly because we found in our first couple of years of study that some of our soccer players would snap their head down when they were making a kick because they weren't really proficient soccer players. But those would actually generate 14, 15 Gs at their peak. So as a result, we figured we'd never really heard of anybody complaining about head injuries or headaches or anything from kicking a ball. So we kind of assumed that must be physiologically okay. It could be wrong, but it's just the reason we've chosen to use 20 G as our threshold. All right, so that was very interesting work. And then we've also been moving on in collaboration with some other colleagues, Hans Breiter, Sam Slobinov, Linda Papa, where we've been working with biomarkers and microRNA, some behavioral measures, virtual reality. And in these cases, we've also been finding that, yes, there were clear evidence of alterations in the physiology, underlying physiology associated with brain function for these athletes that is again heightened at the end of the season or late in the season. And one of the more interesting ones that was recently published is we're starting to see that most of these changes, most of these microRNA, most of the metabolomic changes we're observing are in some way associated with the TCA cycle, breakdown in the TCA cycle, or actually a means for the TCA cycle to achieve its end result via alternate means rather than the traditional pathway. And all of this linked to mitochondrial distress, which is very interesting because mitochondrial distress is also a major component in many of the Alzheimer's studies that are out there. So there's a good linkage there that says that we may not be crazy seeing this in the context that this is known to exist in many neurodegenerative disorders. So that's kind of the pathway we're chasing down now, at least in terms of causes. Now, as engineers, the whole goal is not just to know that something has occurred, but there's also a question of how do we fix it? How do we prevent it? How do we make it better? So in this case, we've been looking at how do we prevent this asymptomatic injury. So how do we do this? One of the couple of things is we want to reduce or slow the accumulation. So as a goal from the perspective of I am a sport lover. My kids play sports. My kids fortunately do not play football, but that's because they're all short. So they play soccer, they play baseball. And my 5'7" oldest son, played center back because he could jump 34 inches. So that's okay, that worked. But the idea here is that how do you prevent the injury? Not so you prevent this altogether, but so that by the end of the season, they haven't accumulated enough injury that you really believe it matters. Now that threshold is still to be determined, but at least if we can slow the process and we have a design criteria to achieve that target, then in theory, we should be able to get there by controlling exposure and controlling the actual amount of force that is transmitted, as well as monitoring them along the way to make sure we're doing something correct. So those are kind of the three paths we're going down: improving training, technique, metering the exposure, and then getting that protective equipment to be better. So there was the nice graphic that Nova made for us a number of years ago on the double shell helmet that we actually somehow got patented. We don't know how, it shouldn't have been, but it was. But Visus then ultimately infringed on it, but that didn't matter because they went out of business. But at the ultimate time, we also have to keep in mind that we have to worry about how these requirements may vary by age, and what's also not up there is by gender. And that's really not well understood. So the first thing we went and looked at was how can we improve technique? So we did a study with the late Paul Auerbach, emergency medicine physician out of Stanford. And we did this in conjunction with the Spring League. Brian Woods, who was in charge of, I guess he's now the owner of the current XFL, was kind enough to let us go down to first San Diego and then to Austin and work with their athletes. So what we actually did is we had the guys focus on changing their stance. So we had them, offensive linemen, either start in a normal 3-point down stance or in a 2-point kind of sitting stance. So if you watch an NFL game or a college game, you'll often see the linemen start already up. And that's typically on a pass play, though they can run out of that. And then another place, you'll see them down with at least one hand down on the ground. And so we actually had them control whether they were during a quarter, try to control whether they were in a 3-point stance or a 2-point stance. And we then looked at how did that affect the impacts that occurred during those plays. And it turned out that the starting stances do have an effect on this exposure. And it turns out that for the offensive linemen, as a general rule, when they started in an up position, just as Paul had hypothesized, they get their hands up. The onrushing player impacts their hands, and they're able to absorb a lot of the energy. They get fewer hits, and those hits were of a lower force level. So that was awesome. This is a really good thing. Maybe this could work. The only problem was when we actually then teased out our data a little bit further, we found that there was a very substantial effect of the skill level of the player. So if this was an individual who'd been playing offensive line for a long time, so we got interview information from the athletes, these guys were all post-collegiate players, but if they had been playing offensive line since, say, middle school, obviously had a lot of experience at offensive line versus somebody who'd been converted from, say, a tight end or a running back to a lineman during their college career, we found there was a big jump where the high skill, the most experienced athletes definitely had an effect from play and definitely were getting hit more when they were in a down stance. But for the guys who hadn't been doing it very long, when they were in up stance, they were getting blown away. They were getting bowled over, knocked over, and getting a lot of injury. And the issue, of course, was we had a predominant number of experienced players in the study versus inexperienced players in the study. So it does suggest, though, that with training, this is something that can be improved, that you can actually get these players to play effectively in that up stance, and that may actually then reduce the number of exposures they take. And since that's the group that we observed had the most, this is a good thing. So we're hoping to look forward at that. We actually took a little bit, we're going to do a little more generalization of that now in terms of taking this from just head injuries to just general repetitive strain injuries. We're working with some wheelchair athletes in Cincinnati, and we're going to actually have them come in, do monitoring, track their activities, do imaging of their shoulders, and we want to look at their shoulder. This is a big issue for wheelchair athletes because, of course, if they get hurt, it also affects their daily life, their ability to transfer from their chair, the ability to even get cereal out of a cabinet cupboard. So this is kind of where we're taking this type of approach, and we're going to be looking at, can we apply that same knowledge to that population? Now, going back to the head injury element of this, that controlled exposure, we actually tried this one year. We worked with one of our local high school teams, and we actually gave the coach just a report on, during each activity you did during the practice, how many hits were occurred, how many hits were of a high G nature, and then they used that to tailor their plans over the course of the season. And so they were able in that way to help start metering the exposure and reduce the exposure. The classic argument from many coaches, I remember Bill Curry coming to an NCAA concussion task force meeting and complaining about how if we took away 2-a-days, we were taking away the fourth quarter and the guys would never be able to play effectively, and all sorts of other hooey that they like to espouse. this team won the state championship, despite the fact that they were working very heavily on controlling. And in fact, since they were the 3A champions and they're a school that should have been in the 2A, they were already playing up because of past performance. They actually won the category above where they should have been. So it clearly didn't hurt them. So that was a big issue for us. Now, finally, when we want to monitor perspective, so that's what we can do with it. How do we predict it? From the monitoring perspective, we do have to worry about the fact that we need useful measures on an individual basis. All of these systems, every telemetry system you buy is just kind of generic, makes an assumption about the size of your head, the distance from the center of your mass to where the sensor is, et cetera. Some of them have that wrong. It's quite entertaining. And that means we really need individualized studies here to do this. So we've actually started looking at pulling out automated head segmentation, getting some of our imaging, stripping out and getting out all the various tissues so that we can build an individual model, not only to, from the MRI or whatever, get the measures we need to do these predictive assessment of their behavior, but also to be able to now start looking at individual finite element analysis models. And can we then take the impacts that an individual occurred and try to refine our models to predict where should we observe changes from a structural perspective or a functional perspective. And if we can do that, now you have a way to take an individual before the season and without having to spend a lot of money on a bunch of imaging throughout the season, just have your monitor and be able to predict that someone's at risk of a change. And that's where we're trying to go with this. Finally, this protective equipment, how is this occurring? The reality is that helmets suck. Any idiot can make a better helmet than is out there. It's really the truth. And one of the worst cases are, in fact, youth helmets. I mentioned youth get hit a lot more. Well, it turns out youth helmets are awful. That middle one on the right, that yellow helmet is a youth helmet. The way you get a helmet approved for youth is you get it approved for an adult, and then you just make it smaller and lighter. And there is no assessment for children's helmets, for youth helmets. So, and top was an effort by Bill Simpson of racing safety fame and Chip Ganassi to build a helmet. That didn't work really well. He never quite understood. We could never get Bill to understand that it's great to have a carbon fiber helmet that you can replace after you've had an accident into a wall. It is not effective to ask a high school to replace a $400 carbon fiber helmet every 30 or so hits. Doesn't work. And then finally, bottom was the mock-up of our double shell helmet. Ultimately, at this point, no manufacturer validates any of their protective claims with regard to the actual brain health. They just do this off these NOxI standards, which I could go on for hours about how bad they are. We've been trying to do this with the $20,000 hammer from the US Army that got in trouble back in the 80s for buying because it seemed like a waste to most people. But when you're going to hit nuclear warheads, it's a really good thing to know what force you're putting in. So we've actually done some work in this, and what we find is that all the helmets have some real issues. We just had a paper published. This is getting a little bit of press right now. And one of the big issues is all the helmets, it turns out, are really bad at absorbing any energy for impacts to the back of the head. Again, Tua Tagovailoa from the Miami Dolphins falls in the back of his head. Sorry, I'll try. Tua Tagovailoa falls down in the back of his head. 2 weeks later, he's out, or within a week, he's out for multiple weeks. Again, an area where the helmet does not absorb energy. All right, so finally, this is just the group that we've been working with on all of this, our wonderful collaborators. A lot of folks, we've been pulling a number of them down to UC of late, and we'll keep trying to do that a little bit more. And then we've also got a number of people who we work with at other institutions or who are moving around, as the case may be. And then here's all the students who've completed theses on these projects over the course of the last 13 years. And they've been wonderful, and they've really made all of this happen. So without them, we don't have, 35, 45 papers on this topic. So it's been wonderful and a lot of fun. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to questions. Sorry.
So first thing is stop the share.
Mhm. I understand that. I think we just did. That just did it. Okay.
Okay, so anyway, this was a great talk. We all enjoyed it a lot. We'll get questions in a second, but I'm always so sorry.
There you go.
Okay, so thank you for the fantastic presentation. So next week we are going to have Catherine Whittington. I don't want that up right yet. from WPI, talking about designing dynamic in vitro models of pancreatic cancer and lymphatic vasculature. And so please follow us on social media to receive the latest updates. You can see our social media information on the next slide. And you can always access the registration information for our BME seminars on the website at bme.columbia.edu. So having done that part, now we can go to actual questions, and we'll start out with our live audience. Okay, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to ask a question about it in my study. So when I think about my study, I really think about possible information. And so it makes sense that we would see increased amount of blockers in the hip.
Right.
So I have two questions for that, and that's what was the what was the time between the last hit and the image? And then whether you're doing any longitudinal studies to look at final time.
Right. So for all of those studies, the what occurred is they would come in before the season, have a imaging session. That would be our baseline session. They would then start their season, and we would pull them in typically on either a Saturday or a Sunday following a game on a Friday. And or for junior varsity players, that might be the evening where they played a game Saturday morning, for example. So as a general rule, less than 24 hours between their last exposure and the subsequent imaging, up to 48 at max. So 24 to 48 hours or less than, actually maybe 6 to 48 is a better statement there. So within 2 days. And then we would do that at least twice during the season, typically around the 4th to 6th week of the season, and then around 10th to 13th week, somewhere in that area. And then we would have them come back again for a postseason scan, a first postseason scan, 3 to 4 weeks after the season. So in theory, they've had 3 weeks since their last exposures. And then we would do at least the second imaging scan. So that first one would take place in November, December, and we would then have another postseason scan around March. So about 4 months, 5 months after the end of the season, in order to see if we had recovery. Now, in terms of longitudinal, we do certainly have athletes who participated in multiple seasons in succession. We have a couple folks who participated in 4 seasons. So we arguably have some longitudinal data from year to year. The catch, of course, is we don't have the ABCD study will in theory provide some of this information, but we don't have controls who weren't exposed to football in that time period. So which of the changes we observe year to year, year over year, are developmental versus recovery or reconstruction following football? We can't answer that, so we haven't studied that yet. Now, once we get some control data, so we understand how this age group progresses year over year when they're not exposed to football on a regular basis, or for a lot of our guys, football followed by wrestling or football, whatever, then we'll be able to start to answer those questions. So I hope that, yeah.
Yeah.
It's also MRI. On one of the athletes that they were diving. What were some of the other impacting factors that took into account?
Right. Right. So with regard to what other factors mattered for athletes outside of their football season, we certainly took into account factors related to what other sport were you doing? So was it a collision-based sport in particular versus a non-collision-based secondary sport? And by that, we emphasized sports where head impacts are kind of the norm. So obviously diving really should be considered a collision-based sport. Volleyball is actually a collision-based sport where you don't dive to the head, hit the head, but you're constantly diving to the ground. So that's really an acceleration, based sport. Baseball's not. Soccer is, basketball isn't, but is, because it has one of the highest rates of concussion among college athletes of all the sports. But it's not supposed to be. Lacrosse for the men is considered a contact sport. Lacrosse for women, bizarrely, is not, just because they aren't supposed to hit one another, which doesn't mean they don't. So you keep track of factors like that. We kept track of years of experience. We kept track of what was their age at which they began to play that sport and those other sports. So all those things were pulled in. Yeah.
In the sense of if it was 5 it's hard. Right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of information that gets collected. So part of the study was, of course, to use the impact test, which is not an effective online test, but it does collect some standard survey information. You get information about how much have they been sleeping. They are high school kids. They aren't sleeping much anyway. And so there is not, and it's all self-reported, so it's not necessarily terribly reliable. One of the other problems we would run into, and one of the things that we tried one year, we actually did a study funded by a milk company, because they wanted us to just assess the effect of drinking chocolate milk after every practice versus, say, a Powerade or Gatorade type drink. We actually had a lot of discussions with the Gatorade folks, but they are so used to working with professional athletes, they could not fathom that we did not have control over the diet of these high school kids. And of course, I'm sure all of you remember from high school, and nobody controlled your diet. So it's just been an interesting. So there are a lot of these factors we really don't have good measures of, and you can get it, you can ask for it, but so we do have information. How many hours of sleep did you have the night before? We do have, are you fatigued, based types of questions. We have them. Nothing really showed to be terribly useful, but we do have it.
Maybe we'll take one question from here and then
Okay.
go to stuff. So there's thanks for the great talk. You mentioned helmets are great to reduce impact. However, are there data to show how much of the impact is caused by the sudden deceleration of the body versus the direct hit to the head?
Right. So this is one of the big things we really need to track down is how much of the force, how much of the basically pressure wave that's moving through the skull is being absorbed by the helmet, how much is actually being distributed to the rest of the body. So one of the things that we do know, let's take, for example, soccer. How many of you guys play soccer or have played soccer at some point in time? So, okay, decent number of you. When you head the ball, you all should know that the last thing you do is sit there, wait, and let the ball hit your head. You actually go up and you attack the ball. That's what leads to an effective header. Well, one of the students who was shown there, Deanna, she actually competed for 5 years or for 4 years as a varsity athlete at Illinois Institute of Technology with their soccer team. And she was all conference. She's really good. And when we were first going out trying to understand soccer, I went out and I was throwing the ball at Professor Eric Nauman, and Eric basically tapped out after about 4 of these because this just hurt too much. And then that was when Deanna got up and we suddenly realized she was doing something completely different. Whereas Eric was standing there waiting for the ball and just kind of bracing for the impact and letting it hit him. She was going up and just driving through that ball. And sure enough, she was actually experiencing lower forces, lower accelerations, because of the fact that she was using her whole body. So that force that was coming in, the effective mass was her body, not her head. So there's clearly a major contribution for this. Now, when you have helmets, one of the big issues, and this has been a discussion for a long time, is that the other problem with helmets, if you look at the little kids, because when we are young, our head is actually not much different than when we're older in terms of its size. So the helmets for the little kids are enormous relative to their body, the little bobbleheads out there. And they don't have the neck musculature to control that helmet. So you watch this helmet wobbling around, and we think that also contributes to them having the same acceleration profile as the older players, because they really don't have the strength to prevent that from moving. So there's a lot of energy that you could probably get rid of by appropriate use of your body, both in a tackle, certainly in a header, preparation from when you're being hit. And so it's a good future study to assess what can we do to make the helmets be more effective, not by necessarily changing the helmet, but by changing the technique, whereby you don't just have all that force delivered just to the head.
So, Christoph, did you want to answer the question?
My question has effectively been.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't hear. Sorry. You mentioned that we can keep it smaller size for kids. So I have a question, like, how does the design of kids helmet be severity to account for geometry skull? Because we're younger, it's still.
It should. So we do need to change the way children's helmets or youth helmets are made. Right now, they literally just make them thinner and with a lighter material. That is the way that it is marketed as a youth helmet. There is no testing of energy absorption. They've never undergone any NOxie testing. They simply transfer the NOxie assessment on the adult helmet, which is a bigger, thicker helmet, to the youth helmet and say, this is fine. So we clearly do need to take into account the fact that the skull is not fully fused. You certainly have less muscular control, so you don't want it to be heavy. So that's not the wrong thing to do. But ultimately, we still need to reconsider how are we designing this so that the energy gets absorbed by the helmet, not by the skull. Now, to some degree, intuitively, and this could be completely wrong, but our intuition is that the fact that the skull plates aren't necessarily completely fused may be helpful, because now the skull can move, have a little bit of give, and therefore some of that energy might get absorbed by that. I don't know if that's a good thing, but it just might absorb some of the energy. But ultimately they need to be assessed and evaluated in the same manner the adult helmets are, and they are not. So right now, if your kid's young, if you can get an adult helmet on them and not have their head flop over, that's probably better. But at the same time, not playing might be the better option. Yep. Right.
And so I know that studies remain concerned long-term with CTE-related effects in sports.
Right.
And so I know that CTE, although concussion related, from the controls, you can't really image that.
Right.
Right. And then also we have, so my concern was, do you have any concerns of loss of critical time points since you calculate this gap and there are gaps in acquisition since you can't in
Right.
CTE, although they have structural and chronic head trauma, obviously there's still large gaps for the data. So do you have any plans of how to overcome these gaps or
Right.
gaps?
So in terms of the gaps and CTE is at such a large time scale relative to anything we're looking at. We know we can't link ourselves to that until a lot of the athletes we've studied are 50 years old, 60 years old. So I got another 30 years before I can do anything on that front from my athletes. Now, if we can work with a high collegiate population or a professional population, we may be able to close that gap and do something in a closer time period. But the real question that we're trying to get to from our side in this regard is, can we see changes that are consistent with evidence from Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, or other neurodegenerative disorders? Do we see anything that's consistent with that occurring at an early stage? So for example, we had you sound so vulturish when you do this type of work. We had the fortune, I'm not saying good, but we had the fortune that one of our students was involved in a very bad car accident, ended up in the hospital, was unconscious for a while, and he went back to play the next year. And so we actually got him back into the MRI for a preseason before the next season, before he'd had any more head collisions. And he had huge changes in his white matter structure, just so much larger than we would have anticipated or we were seeing from any of our other athletes. Until we looked at the end of season assessments, then we found that our athletes who were taking huge numbers of hits were getting white matter changes in terms of the volume of the brain, the percentage of the volume of the brain that was almost as large as he'd had from his car accident. So what can we say from that? We can make an argument that there's a reasonable argument to be made that collision, that set of smaller collisions over the course of the season was producing as much alteration in brain structure as a substantial car accident had caused about a month after the accident. Does that answer CTE? No. But now if we start understanding what are those changes actual, local cell death? Are they just prolonged inflammation? Are we looking at breakdown of the fibers within the axon that give it its structure? That's what we need to get to. If we can start to answer that question, now we might be able to start answering the CTE question. And especially because, there's still this whole discussion about CTE, what is it, what isn't it? But, at the end of the day, we do see that these professional athletes have a much higher rate of neurodegenerative and psychological problems later in life. So there's at least something going on. If we can start to predict, or at least be able to say that we see these changes that are associated with those later disorders, then we're probably getting somewhere useful.
one last question here and then we'll,
So, that a little bit more, especially like when you, that kind of goes back to my original question a little bit. We talked a lot about, early season, pre-season, after season, which kind of implies that you're expecting some, healing or whatever you might call it, going back to a baseline.
Right.
There's case point of a potential longitudinal, like accumulation of damage in some ways.
Yes.
But basically, I can see the beauty of all these metrics and measures, but basically, where is the mechanisms? And that kind of goes back to what you just said. If X were to die, this will not go back after the season.
Correct.
Right. So basically, if it's something like a simple swelling, that I could see.
Yeah.
It's simple information I can see. But basically, how much do you know about, and also but honestly, spectroscopy data, they all look the same. So
Right.
basically, they're all a star, but
Yeah, they're not large changes. They're not huge changes. They're just consistent changes. Right. Right. Right.
Where do you stand?
Our feeling is that we really believe that we are seeing the changes from the DTI changes and the connectivity changes are the ones that we find to be most robust, most reliable in our data. And so those are suggestive of an initial swelling, some sort of inflammation. And then at some point, many of the athletes remain in sort of that inflammation state, so kind of elevated FA measures, reduced MD measures, but then some of them start to drop to a notably decreased FA. And now those are the ones where you're starting, and those are typically athletes who've had a lot of hits. And so that's the question where you're starting to say, are we starting to break cells? But we're not necessarily killing cells, but are we at least just, breaking some dissociation between the myelin sheath and the neuron? In fact, and that's known, has been shown to occur that when you have impacts to neurons, you can actually get the myelin to break free of the axon, thereby allowing greater diffusion out of the axon, even though it's still somewhat contained within this now wider myelin sheath. So I think that we're definitely seeing. I believe we can see that. So I think that's one of the mechanisms that's occurring. And then the other question becomes, have we had some level of increased use? Sorry. Yeah.
Is there remyelination in terms of similar?
Right.
Sort of
right. It's not supposed to, but the question is, like I said, at the end of the day, what we're seeing is, okay, the myelin, it's dissociating, it's detaching, but it's not going away. Yeah. So are we just creating a wider channel at the end of the day, and there's some sort of adaptation? That's entirely possible. There is some evidence from repeated impacts in animal models that the nodes of Ranvier become bigger also. So it could be that what's really occurring at some level from a central processing perspective, I don't know, from a physiologic perspective, is that we're allowing a greater influx and efflux of ions. So we're actually managing to conduct effectively, but it's a compensation for the fact that the myelin isn't doing its job quite as effectively. So
and now it's
yep.
What fraction would you say is reversible, and what fraction of things we see is so much
right.
Right.
For the kids who don't hit a huge excessive amount, it looks like it's at least 96% easily recovered, easily bounces back at the end of the season. They don't seem to have a lot of issues. For the kids who are hitting a lot, we don't actually ever see them get back after even after, like we had one guy actually came in 2 years later for a separate issue. And when he agreed to go in for an imaging study, and his numbers were still off, still messed up. So I think when we get to the kids who are taking those, and I don't know the magic number yet, but from our earlier studies, there's a suggestion of it being this 90 to 100 hits a week. Those kids don't recover even by 4, 5, 6 months after the season. And some of them actually by the following preseason, their numbers are still actually outside where they were the previous preseason. But that's where we get into the issue of how much of this is development versus how much is change. And that's where we need to get to a slightly different population. If we could at least work with the college athletes where we've seen a slowdown in the growth of white matter myelination, or if we get actually work with the professional athletes or at least post-collegiate athletes, we might have a better answer to that question. Exactly. We want to get them relative to their controls, but for the kids who aren't doing too much, I don't think there's a really major issue. It's for the kids who are starting and who are really intense, and you have so many coaches who are going to chew on you because you didn't make a loud sound with your helmet when you hit that other kid. I think those are the kids who are at real risk, and that's their concern.
So well, let's
Okay.
speaker one more time.
The coaches are the biggest issue. They are the biggest issue. Yes.